June 260 CE. The scorching plains near Edessa in northern Mesopotamia. Legionary Marcus Valerius pressed his shield tighter against the man beside him as the ground began to tremble. At first it felt like distant thunder, a low rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. Then the veterans in the front ranks began to shout warnings, their voices cracking with something Valerius had never heard from Roman soldiers before. Raw, unfiltered terror. Through the shimmering heat haze, shapes emerged. Massive, impossible shapes that seemed to defy everything the Romans understood about warfare. War elephants. Not the small North African elephants Hannibal had used 5 centuries earlier, elephants the Romans had learned to counter with fire and javelins. These were Sassanian war elephants, Indian elephants standing 11 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing 6 tons each, their tusks sharpened to points and covered in bronze caps, their foreheads protected by scale armour, carrying wooden towers on their backs filled with Persian archers. The Battle of Edessa would become one of Rome's most catastrophic defeats, the first time a Roman emperor would be captured alive in battle, and the engagement that shattered the myth of Roman military invincibility. But before the political disaster, before the capture of Emperor Valerian, before the strategic collapse that would reshape the ancient world, there was a single moment when the Sassanian war elephants hit the Roman line. What happened in those seconds would be remembered by survivors with the kind of detail that only absolute horror burns into human memory. The campaign that led to Edessa began with Roman arrogance and ended with Roman humiliation. Emperor Valerian, 60 years old and a respected senator before his elevation to the purple in 253 CE, had marched east with perhaps the finest army Rome could assemble in the mid-3rd century. Contemporary sources vary, but the consensus among modern historians suggests Valerian commanded between 60,000 and 70,000 troops. 7 legions formed the core, including Legio III Gallica, Legio XVI Flavia Firma, and Legio Forcosithica, veteran units with centuries of history. Supporting them were auxiliary cohorts, cavalry wings, and the Praetorian Guard itself, the emperor's personal protection. Facing them was Shapur I, King of Kings of the Sassanian Empire, a ruler who had spent 2 decades transforming Persia into Rome's deadliest adversary. Shapur had already defeated one Roman emperor, killing Philip the Arab in 249 CE, and his army represented the culmination of Persian military evolution. The Sassanians had taken the Parthian military system, with its famed horse archers and cataphract heavy cavalry, and added systematic infantry, siege equipment, and the most terrifying weapon in ancient warfare, organized war elephant units. The Romans had been campaigning in Mesopotamia for months with mixed success. They had captured several cities, but disease was ravaging the legions. Plague, possibly a return of the Antonine plague that had devastated the empire decades earlier, was killing more Romans than Persian weapons. Ancient historian Lactantius, writing decades later, claimed the army was already weakened when Shapur's forces trapped them near Edessa. The tactical situation was a Roman nightmare. Valerian's army, strung out and exhausted, found itself cut off from water supplies and surrounded by superior Persian cavalry. The Romans formed a defensive position, but they were fighting on ground chosen by Shapur, and the Persian king had been preparing for this moment. He had assembled the largest concentration of war elephants ever deployed against Rome. Sources suggest between 20 and 30 elephants, each one a mobile fortress designed to break infantry formations. The Romans knew elephants were coming. Scouts had reported their presence days earlier. Valerian's officers, educated men familiar with military history, would have reviewed every recorded elephant encounter. They knew how Scipio Africanus had defeated Hannibal's elephants at Zama in 202 BCE by opening lanes in the Roman formation, allowing the beast to pass harmlessly through. They knew how pigs had been used at the siege of Megara in 206 BCE, the squealing and smell-driving elephants into panic. They knew how Roman velites, light skirmishers, had learned to target elephant eyes and trunks with javelins. But this was not Hannibal's war. This was not a handful of smaller African elephants employed as shock troops without coordination. Shapur's elephant corps was a fully integrated combined arms weapon system that had been refined through decades of warfare against Parthian rebels, nomadic invaders, and Roman legions. Each elephant was more than an animal, It was a platform for multiple weapon systems, a mobile command post, and a psychological weapon designed to shatter enemy morale. The typical Sassanian war elephant configuration was terrifying in its efficiency. The elephant itself was trained from birth for war, conditioned to charge into spear walls to ignore pain, to respond to mahout commands even in the chaos of battle. The mahout, the driver, sat on the elephant's neck, guiding it with an ankus, a hooked tool that could deliver pain commands to pressure points behind the elephant's ears. Behind the mahout sat a wooden howdah, a tower structure protected by wicker shields and leather panels. Inside this tower were typically 4 men. 2 archers with composite bows capable of piercing Roman armour at 200 yards, 1 spearman with a long pike for engaging approaching infantry, and 1 commander coordinating with adjacent elephant crews. But the elephant was more than a platform, it was a weapon. An adult Indian elephant could move at speeds up to 25 miles per hour in a charge. At 6 tons of muscle, bone and fury moving at that speed, the kinetic energy was devastating. The sharpened, bronze-capped tusks could gore through multiple men with a single sweep of the head. The trunk, stronger than any human arm, could grab soldiers and throw them into the air or crush them against the ground. The feet, each weighing hundreds of pounds, could trample men in armour into unrecognisable pulp. Shapur positioned his elephants at the centre of his formation, protected by screens of infantry and supported by wings of cavalry. The tactical doctrine was clear. Persian archers and slingers would weaken the Roman formation with missile fire. Persian cavalry would threaten the flanks, preventing Roman manoeuvre. Then, at the critical moment, the elephants would charge the Roman centre, supported by Persian infantry following in their wake. Valerian's dispositions reflected Roman tactical orthodoxy. The legions formed in checkerboard pattern, the traditional manipular formation that had conquered the Mediterranean world. The front lines consisted of hastati, younger soldiers with javelins and gladius short swords. Behind them stood the principes, experienced legionaries in their prime. The third line contained the triarion, veterans who would commit only in desperate situations. The cavalry, outnumbered by Persian horse, protected the flanks as best they could. But there was a problem Roman commanders had recognized but couldn't solve. The Roman military system was designed to fight other infantry. The gladius was optimized for close combat between formations of heavy infantry. The pilum javelin was designed to punch through shields and armour at short range, making shields unusable and forcing enemies into sword range. The entire tactical doctrine assumed closing with the enemy and engaging in disciplined close combat where Roman training and equipment superiority would prevail. War elephants rendered this doctrine obsolete. A legionary couldn't close with an elephant. The gladius, deadly against human opponents, was too short to reach vital points on a creature standing 11 feet tall. The pilum, while it could wound an elephant, lacked the mass to stop a charging beast. The scutum shield, large enough to protect against spears and arrows, was simply pushed aside by 6 tons of momentum. The Romans were equipped and trained for the wrong fight. As the 2 armies faced each other across perhaps 500 yards of dusty plain, the psychological warfare began. The Persians, understanding the terror elephants produced, had decorated their beasts for maximum psychological impact. Red and gold cloth hangings adorned the howdahs. Bronze bells hung from the elephants' legs, creating a distinctive jangling roar as they moved. The mahouts wore elaborate costumes designed to make them appear larger and more threatening. The elephants themselves had been painted with symbols and patterns that made their already enormous bulk seem even more massive and alien. The Romans responded with their own psychological preparation. Centurions moved through the ranks, reminding men of Roman victories, invoking the spirits of ancestors who had defeated Hannibal, conquered Gaul and humbled Parthia. Officers shouted that elephants were just animals, that Roman iron and discipline would prevail as they always had. But the shaking in the ranks was visible. These were experienced soldiers, men who had faced Germanic tribes and Persian cavalry without flinching, and they were afraid. The battle opened with the usual preliminary skirmishing. Roman velites and Persian light infantry exchanged missiles, neither side gaining advantage. Persian horse archers swept around the flanks, peppering Roman cavalry with arrows, forcing them to cluster more tightly. This was the standard opening of Romano-Persian engagements, a testing phase where each side probed for weakness. Then Shapur gave the order. The elephants began to move. At first they walked, a slow advance that allowed the formation to maintain cohesion. The ground shaking was no longer distant thunder, but a constant tremor that Roman soldiers could feel through their sandals. The sound was overwhelming. 20 to 30 elephants, each weighing 6 tons, moving in formation, created a low-frequency rumble that seemed to vibrate in soldiers' chests. Mixed with this was the jangling of bronze bells, the shouting of mahouts, the trumpeting of the elephants themselves, a shrill, alien sound that cut through the normal battlefield noise. Roman archers and slingers opened fire at maximum range, perhaps 200 yards. Arrows and lead shot arced toward the approaching elephants. Some hit. Most bounced off the scale armor protecting the elephants' heads and fronts. A few found gaps, driving into flesh, causing elephants to trumpet in pain. But pain didn't stop them. Elephants, especially war elephants conditioned to ignore wounds, continued advancing. At 150 yards, the Roman front line began their response. The Hastati raised their pila, the heavy javelins that had broken countless shield walls. The centurions timed the volley carefully, waiting until the elephants were at optimal range. The command rang out. Release. Hundreds of pila arced toward the elephants in a dark cloud. The javelins struck home. Many hit the scale armor and deflected. Some drove into the elephant's shoulders and flanks. A few found eyes or trunks, causing catastrophic wounds. One elephant in the Persian center took a pilum through the eye, the iron point driving deep into its brain. It dropped instantly, a 6-ton corpse that crashed to the ground, throwing its howdah crew clear. Another elephant, struck in the trunk by multiple javelins, turned and ran, trumpeting in agony, trampling through the Persian infantry following behind. These were the Roman success stories, the moments when Roman weapons and training produced the desired result. But they were not enough. Out of perhaps 25 elephants in the charge, the Romans dropped or turned maybe 3 or 4, the rest kept coming, and now they were at 100 yards, close enough that Roman soldiers could see the men in the howdahs, could see the bronze tusk caps gleaming in the sun, could hear individual elephant trumpets rather than a general roar, close enough to see that the wall of grey flesh and ivory was not stopping. At 75 yards, the Persian archers in the howdahs opened fire. Each elephant carried at least 2 bowmen, meaning the charging elephant line delivered a concentrated volley of 40 to 50 arrows directly into the Roman front ranks. These were not the light arrows of skirmishers. Persian composite bows drawn by men shooting from stable platforms could drive arrows through Roman armor at this range. Men in the front line jerked backward, arrows protruding from necks, faces, arms. The gaps created by casualties were immediately filled by men from the second line, maintaining the integrity of the formation, but the psychological impact was severe. The Romans couldn't effectively return fire. The elephants were moving targets, protected by armor and supported by their own missile troops. At 50 yards, the elephants accelerated. This was the critical moment. Mahouts delivered the command to charge, and the trained war elephants shifted from a walk to their maximum speed. Contemporary sources don't provide exact numbers, but modern analysis suggests war elephants could reach 20 to 25 miles per hour in a short charge. For the Roman soldiers in the front ranks, watching 20-plus multi-ton creatures accelerate toward them was the moment when training and discipline confronted pure instinct. Every survival mechanism in the human brain was screaming to run. Most didn't. The front line held. These were professional soldiers, men who had trained for years, who had faced death before, who stood in formation because the man beside them was standing, because the centurion behind them would cut down anyone who broke, because Roman dignity demanded they face the enemy. They raised their shields, planted their feet, and prepared to receive the charge. They were about to discover that courage, discipline, and training were not enough. The impact occurred at approximately 30 yards per second closing speed. An elephant hitting a Roman formation at full charge delivered kinetic energy that no human structure could withstand. The front rank of Romans, shields raised and feet planted, simply ceased to exist as a coherent formation. The physics were brutal. A 6-ton elephant moving at 20 miles per hour possessed approximately 300,000 joules of kinetic energy. The Roman soldiers in its path, each weighing perhaps 200 pounds with equipment, possessed zero momentum. When the elephant hit, its momentum barely changed. The humans were not obstacles, but objects to be scattered. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, a surviving centurion from Legio Forsythica who lived to write a fragmentary account preserved in later Byzantine collections, described the moment. The elephant struck our line like Jupiter's fist. The sound was not what I expected. Not a crash or clash of arms, but a wet crushing. Noise, the sound of bodies breaking. The man in front of me, Gaius, a good soldier, a man with 2 children in Antioch, simply vanished under the elephant's feet. His scream was cut off mid-sound. When the elephant passed, there was only red paste pressed into the earth where Gaius had stood. The elephants didn't stop at the front line. Their momentum carried them through the first rank into the second, sometimes into the third. Each elephant created a corridor of destruction, perhaps 15 feet wide. In that corridor, Roman soldiers were gored by tusks, trampled by feet, grabbed by trunks and thrown into the air, or simply knocked aside with bone-breaking force. The checkerboard formation that had worked against human opponents became a death trap against elephants. The gaps between maniples, designed to allow flexibility and mutual support, became channels for the elephants to exploit. The howdah crews continued fighting throughout the charge. Archers fired directly down into the Roman formation at point-blank range. Arrows drove through the tops of shoulders, necks and heads, areas of the body not protected by shields or armour. The spearmen in the howdahs used their long pikes to stab at Roman soldiers trying to reach the elephants' flanks. The coordination was practiced and efficient. The elephants created chaos. The howdah crews killed anyone trying to respond to that chaos. Behind the elephants came Persian infantry. Shapur's foot soldiers, often dismissed by Roman historians as inferior to legionaries, followed in the wake of the elephant charge with brutal efficiency. They didn't need to break the Roman formation. The elephants had already done that. They simply had to kill or capture disorganized Romans who were no longer fighting as a cohesive unit. Persian spearmen and swordsmen, moving through corridors trampled clear by elephant feet, found Romans still reeling from the initial impact, Romans who had lost their position in formation, Romans who were wounded or separated from their units. The Roman response revealed both courage and futility. Individual legionaries attempted to kill elephants with the weapons they had. Some soldiers threw themselves under the elephants, trying to stab upward into the belly with their gladius short swords. A few succeeded in wounding elephants, none succeeded in stopping them. The gladius blade, optimized for thrusting into human torsos, simply didn't have the reach or mass to penetrate deep enough into an elephant's vitals to cause rapid death. A wounded elephant was still a functional elephant, still capable of killing, and now enraged by pain. Other Romans targeted the mahouts, the drivers who controlled the elephants. This was sound tactical thinking. Kill the mahout, and the elephant became uncontrolled, potentially dangerous to both sides. Some Roman archers and javelin throwers managed to kill or wound mahouts. But the mahouts were positioned behind the elephant's armoured head, partially protected by the howdah structure and surrounded by howdah crew members who would immediately engage anyone targeting the driver. For every mahout killed, dozens of Romans died trying. The centurions attempted to maintain order. These were the backbone of the Roman military system, experienced professional officers who could impose discipline through force of personality and physical violence if necessary. They shouted orders, rallied men, tried to form defensive clusters that could present a unified front. In some areas, this worked temporarily. Small groups of Romans formed defensive squares, shields outward, preventing Persian infantry from overwhelming them. But these isolated formations were systematically destroyed by returning elephant charges or simply bypassed by the Persian advance. The entire Roman centre, perhaps 20,000 men across 3 lines of infantry, disintegrated in approximately 10 to 15 minutes. This wasn't a gradual erosion of position but catastrophic structural failure. The Roman military system required formation integrity to function. Individual legionaries, however skilled, were not effective when isolated. The gladius required close formation to work. Shield walls required coordinated movement. The entire tactical doctrine required unit cohesion. The elephant charge shattered that cohesion instantly and irreparably. The casualties in this initial breakthrough are staggering. Modern historians estimating from fragmentary sources suggest the Roman centre lost 30 to 40% of its strength in the first 20 minutes of elephant engagement. This means 6,000 to 8,000 men killed, wounded, or so disorganized they were combat ineffective. These weren't losses accumulated over hours of fighting, but concentrated in the brief period when the elephants tore through the Roman formation. The psychological impact extended beyond the men directly in the elephant's path. Roman soldiers in adjacent formations could see what was happening to the centre. They watched as their comrades, men they had trained with and fought beside, were destroyed not in honest combat but in what appeared to be slaughter. The difference is psychologically significant. Soldiers can process losses in normal combat where both sides are taking casualties and individual skill matters. But watching an entire formation simply cease to exist under an unstoppable force creates a different psychological state. Helplessness and terror rather than the controlled fear of normal combat. The Roman wings, cavalry and auxiliary infantry on the flanks began to waver. These units had not yet been engaged by elephants, but could see the centre collapsing. Unit cohesion depends on confidence in mutual support. When soldiers see that the formation is failing, that retreat might be the only survival option, the psychological calculation changes. Officers lose control. Men begin looking for escape routes rather than enemies to fight. The formation doesn't break all at once, but begins to dissolve as individuals make independent decisions to survive. Valerian, positioned with the Praetorian Guard behind the main line, could see the disaster unfolding. Roman emperors in the field were supposed to be focal points of resistance, sources of inspiration that could rally broken units, but there was nothing Valerian could do. The elephants had broken through, the centre was collapsing. Persian cavalry was beginning to envelope the flanks, the army was being destroyed, and the emperor's position was becoming untenable. The specific moment when Valerian was captured is disputed in ancient sources. Some accounts suggest he attempted to negotiate, approaching the Persian lines under a truce flag that Shapur violated by seizing him. Other sources claim he was simply overrun when his guard formation was scattered by a combination of elephant attack and cavalry charge. The most reliable accounts suggest Valerian's capture occurred when his bodyguard unit, probably the Praetorian Guard, was broken by coordinated Persian assault that included both elephants and cataphract heavy cavalry. The capture of a Roman emperor in battle was unprecedented. Roman emperors had died in battle before. Augustus' subordinate Varus had lost 3 legions and died at Teutoburg Forest. Decius had been killed fighting Goths at Abritus just a decade earlier, but these emperors had died fighting. They had not been taken alive to be displayed as prisoners. Valerian's capture represented a fundamental break in Roman military prestige. The battle continued after Valerian's capture, but it was no longer a battle in any meaningful sense. It was a massacre and a rout. Roman units that had maintained some formation broke when word spread that the emperor was captured. Soldiers who had been fighting in organised withdrawal began running. The Persians pursued methodically. Cavalry ran down fleeing infantry. Elephants, following behind the main pursuit, killed or scattered any remaining Roman formations. The organised Roman army that had marched into Mesopotamia months earlier ceased to exist as a military force. The casualty figures are debated by historians, but the lowest credible estimates suggest the Romans lost 40,000 men at Edessa. The highest estimates approach 60,000. Even taking the conservative numbers, this made Edessa one of the bloodiest Roman defeats in history, comparable to Cannae or Teutoburg Forest, but the nature of the defeat was different. At Cannae, Hannibal's tactical genius and the failure of Roman command had destroyed the army. At Teutoburg, ambush and terrain had trapped the legions. At Edessa, a weapon system had simply proved superior to Roman tactical doctrine. The war elephants didn't achieve this alone. Persian cavalry, infantry and archers all contributed. Shapur's strategic positioning, trapping the Romans without water and supplies, created the conditions for decisive battle. Roman disease and exhaustion weakened the legions before fighting began. But the specific moment when the Roman centre broke, when organised resistance became impossible, was caused by the elephant charge. Without the elephants, the battle might have been a Persian victory through attrition. With the elephants, it became an annihilating Roman defeat. The aftermath of Edessa resonated through the ancient world. Shapur commemorated his victory with elaborate inscriptions and reliefs, carved into rock faces at Nakshi Rostam, near Persepolis. These reliefs, still visible today, show Valerian kneeling before Shapur, the Roman emperor reduced to a suppliant position before the Persian king of kings. The inscriptions, written in 3 languages, describe Shapur's victories in detail, emphasizing the capture of the Roman emperor and the destruction of his army. The Roman response to Edessa was complex. Official histories minimized the disaster. Later Christian historians like Lactantius blamed Valerian's persecution of Christians for divine punishment. Secular historians emphasized Persian treachery rather than military superiority. but soldiers who fought at Edessa and survived carried memories that shaped Roman military doctrine for decades. The war elephant, previously dismissed as an obsolete weapon defeated by Roman tactics centuries earlier, was recognized as a threat requiring new countermeasures. The Romans never successfully developed effective anti-elephant tactics in the aftermath of Edessa. This wasn't for lack of trying. Military manuals proposed various solutions: fire arrows to panic the beasts, specialized anti-elephant javelins with longer, heavier points, infantry formations with wider spacing to allow elephants to pass through without contact, mobile ballista platforms to engage elephants at range. None of these proved practical in the chaos of actual combat. The fundamental problem was doctrinal. The Roman military system was the product of centuries of evolution fighting Mediterranean infantry. It was optimized for a specific type of combat: heavy infantry formations engaging other heavy infantry formations at close range. War elephants represented a different paradigm, one where mass and momentum mattered more than discipline and sword skill. To defeat elephants, Romans would have needed to fundamentally restructure their tactical approach, perhaps adopting more flexible formations, lighter equipment, and different weapons. Such changes would have made them less effective against their other enemies. The Romans never solved this dilemma. In practical terms, the Romans avoided the problem rather than solving it. After Edessa, Roman strategy in the east became defensive. Instead of deep penetrations into Persian territory, where they might face elephant charges in open battle, the Romans focused on fortified positions and limited offensives. When battles occurred, Roman commanders tried to choose terrain unsuitable for elephants, broken ground or mountains where the massive beasts couldn't charge effectively. This strategic adjustment represented a significant shift. For centuries, Rome had been the offensive power in the east, dictating when and where battles occurred. After Edessa, the strategic initiative passed to Persia. Shapur and his successors could threaten Roman territory, besiege Roman cities, and force battles when conditions favoured Persian strengths. The Romans responded but rarely initiated. The war elephants themselves were not invincible. Persian forces lost battles after Edessa. Individual elephants were killed or driven off. But the threat they represented, the memory of what they had done to the Roman centre at Edessa, created a psychological advantage that persisted. Roman soldiers facing Persian armies knew that elephants might be present. That knowledge affected morale and tactical decision-making, even when elephants weren't actually deployed. The long-term impact on the Roman military system was subtle but significant. The Romans increasingly relied on barbarian auxiliary forces who brought their own tactical systems and weapons. Gothic warriors, Germanic cavalry, Saracen archers, all groups with different tactical traditions, became more prominent in Roman armies. These forces often performed better against Eastern enemies precisely because they weren't locked into the heavy infantry doctrine that made Roman legions vulnerable to elephants. The strategic consequences of Edessa extended beyond military defeat. Valerian's capture created a succession crisis. His son Gallienus was elevated to full Augustus and ruled for 8 years, but his legitimacy was compromised by his father's humiliation. The Roman East descended into chaos. Palmyra under Queen Zenobia would briefly become independent. Usurpers appeared throughout the eastern provinces. The Persian border remained unstable for decades. The empire nearly fragmented completely in the period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Shapur's treatment of Valerian varied in different accounts. Roman sources claimed Shapur used the captured emperor as a footstool, forcing Valerian to bend down so the Persian king could step on his back when mounting his horse. When Valerian finally died in captivity, supposedly Shapur had his body flayed, the skin stuffed with straw, and displayed in a Persian temple as a warning to future Roman ambassadors. Persian sources unsurprisingly don't mention these details, focusing instead on Shapur's clemency toward the captured emperor and the Roman soldiers who entered Persian service. The archaeological evidence from Edessa is limited. The battlefield location is approximately known but not precisely identified. No systematic excavation has been conducted. This isn't surprising. Ancient battlefields rarely leave obvious archaeological traces, especially in regions that have seen continuous habitation and warfare for 2 millennia. What does survive is the textual evidence, fragmentary and biased but consistent enough to reconstruct the basic narrative. The military analysis of Edessa has evolved over centuries of historical scholarship. Early modern historians, writing when cavalry and infantry still dominated warfare, focused on tactical details and Roman failures of leadership. 20th century historians familiar with mechanized warfare drew parallels between war elephants and tanks, viewing Edessa as an early example of breakthrough tactics using shock weapons. Contemporary historians with access to better source criticism and archaeological methods emphasize the broader context, the disease, the strategic situation, the evolution of Romano-Persian conflict, but the core event remains. On a dusty plain near Edessa in 260 CE, Sassanian war elephants broke a Roman line in seconds. Professional soldiers, armed and trained according to centuries of military tradition, found themselves facing a weapon system they couldn't counter. The courage of individual Romans, the discipline of the legions, the prestige of Rome itself, none of it mattered when 6 tons of war elephant moving at 20 miles per hour hit a formation optimized for a different kind of war. The survivors of Edessa, the few Roman soldiers who escaped the disaster and made it back to Roman territory, carried memories that would haunt them. They had stood in formation as they were trained to do. They had held their ground when every instinct screamed to run. They had fought with the weapons and tactics that had conquered the known world, and they had been broken in seconds by an enemy that simply pushed through them like they weren't there. Marcus Valerius, the legionary whose perspective opened this account, survived Edessa. His testimony, preserved in fragments quoted by later Byzantine historians, describes stumbling through the Persian pursuit in darkness, hiding among corpses during the day, and finally reaching Roman lines after a week of desperate flight. He never fought in another major battle. The experience of standing in formation as the elephants charged, of watching the front lines simply cease to exist, of seeing the Roman military system fail completely against an enemy it couldn't defeat, had broken something fundamental in his understanding of warfare. The Battle of Edessa stands as one of history's clearest examples of technological and tactical mismatch. The Romans weren't cowards. They weren't poorly trained or badly equipped by the standards of their era. They were professional soldiers employing a military system that had conquered from Britain to Mesopotamia. But systems optimized for one type of warfare can fail catastrophically when confronted with weapons they weren't designed to counter. The Roman heavy infantry doctrine that had destroyed Gallic warbands and Macedonian phalanxes simply had no answer for war elephants used as breakthrough weapons in combined arms assaults. The war elephants of Sassanian Persia represented the peak of this weapon system's development. Earlier elephants, the ones Hannibal brought to Italy or that Alexander faced in India, had been employed more crudely, often as terror weapons without sophisticated integration into combined arms tactics. The Sassanians had refined elephant warfare over generations, understanding how to protect the beasts with armour, support them with other forces, and employ them at the decisive point in battle. The elephants at Edessa weren't just animals on a battlefield, they were a weapon system as sophisticated and effective as any in the ancient world. The day the Sassanian war elephants broke the Roman line at Edessa lasted only seconds for the soldiers who experienced it. But those seconds echoed through Roman consciousness for generations, a moment when the supposedly invincible legions discovered they were not adapted to every kind of war, when courage and discipline weren't enough, when the thunder of elephant feet and the trumpeting of enraged beasts announced that Rome's dominance of the ancient world was not as absolute as Romans had believed. The elephants had spoken, and the message was one Rome would spend the next century trying to forget. This psychological transformation of the Roman military after Edessa cannot be overstated. Before 260 CE, Roman military culture was built on absolute confidence. Recruits were taught that Roman discipline, Roman weapons, Roman tactics were inherently superior to anything barbarians or Eastern kingdoms could field. This wasn't just propaganda. It was backed by centuries of mostly successful warfare. Young men joining the legions believed they were entering an invincible institution, that proper training and adherence to doctrine guaranteed victory. Edessa shattered that confidence for an entire generation of Eastern soldiers. The men who survived and were eventually ransomed or escaped brought back stories that contradicted everything Roman military culture taught. They described standing in proper formation, following orders perfectly, doing exactly what their training prescribed, and being destroyed anyway. They described watching centurions, the embodiment of Roman military professionalism, being trampled into paste while shouting commands that no longer mattered. They described a kind of combat where individual skill, unit cohesion, and tactical doctrine were irrelevant against sheer physical mass and momentum. The Roman military establishment struggled with how to process these accounts. Official reports emphasized Persian numbers, treachery, disease weakening the army, any factor except the possibility that Roman tactical doctrine had fundamental flaws. But soldiers talk, and the stories spread through the legions. By 265 CE, every soldier stationed in the eastern provinces had heard multiple accounts of Edessa. They knew what war elephants could do. They knew that the formations they trained in, the weapons they carried, the tactics they practiced might not be adequate if they faced the Sassanian, elephant corps. This knowledge created what military psychologists would now call anticipatory stress. Soldiers preparing for combat in the East weren't just facing normal pre-battle anxiety. They were facing the specific fear that they might encounter a weapon they couldn't counter, that their training might be useless, that courage and discipline might not be enough. This psychological burden affected combat effectiveness even in battles where no elephants appeared. Roman units in the East became more cautious, more defensive, less willing to press attacks when facing Persian resistance. The Persian Empire under Shapur and his successors exploited this psychological advantage ruthlessly. Persian commanders learned to spread rumours before battles that elephant units were present even when they weren't. The mere threat of elephants could disrupt Roman formations and tactical planning. When elephants were actually deployed, Persian commanders made sure Romans knew it, parading the beasts within sight of Roman lines before battle, allowing the fear to build, letting Roman soldiers contemplate what was coming. The economic and logistical aspects of elephant warfare are often overlooked, but were crucial to understanding why the Romans couldn't simply adopt the weapon themselves. An adult war elephant required approximately 300 pounds of fodder per day, plus 30 to 40 gallons of water. Maintaining an elephant corps of 30 animals meant moving 4 to 5 tons of food and over 1,000 gallons of water daily just for the elephants, not counting the mahouts and howdah crews. The Sassanian Empire, with its roots in the Indian trade networks and control of territories where elephants were native, could sustain this logistical burden. Rome could not. The Romans did attempt to acquire elephants after Edessa. Emperor Gallienus reportedly obtained several elephants through diplomatic channels with North African kingdoms. But these were smaller African forest elephants, not the massive Indian elephants the Sassanians deployed. More critically, Rome lacked the institutional knowledge to train war elephants. Training a war elephant required starting when the animal was young, ideally under 5 years old, and working with it for years to condition it for battlefield stress. The Sassanians had been doing this for generations. They had training programs, experienced mahouts, established doctrine. Rome would have needed decades to develop equivalent expertise, and they never committed the resources. The Roman response instead focused on avoiding elephant encounters through strategic choices. The defensive fortification line in the east, which would eventually become the basis for Byzantine defensive strategy, began to take shape in the decades after Edessa. Rather than mobile armies seeking decisive battles in open terrain where elephants could be employed, Roman strategy emphasized fortified cities, mountain passes, and defensive positions where terrain neutralized elephant advantages. This strategic shift had profound implications for the nature of Romano-Persian conflict. Before Edessa, wars in the east followed a pattern. Rome would assemble a large army, march into Persian territory, besiege Persian cities, and force Persia to respond. Battles occurred, but often the Roman advance itself achieved strategic objectives by disrupting Persian territory and economy. After Edessa, this pattern reversed. Persian armies, confident in their ability to win decisive battles, increasingly took the offensive. Roman armies, aware of their vulnerability in open battle, focused on defending key positions and avoiding decisive engagements unless terrain favoured them. The Battle of Sangara in 344 CE, nearly a century after Edessa, demonstrated both how much and how little had changed. Emperor Constantius II faced Shapur II with armies that were larger than those at Edessa, but employed similar tactics. The Persians again deployed war elephants as breakthrough weapons. Roman forces, now more experienced in facing elephants, attempted to counter them with concentrated missile fire and mobile reserves that could plug gaps in the line. The battle initially went well for Rome. Roman forces held their formation despite elephant attacks and inflicted heavy casualties on Persian infantry. But as the day progressed and elephants made repeated charges, the Roman line began to fragment. The pattern from Edessa repeated. Individual Roman courage and tactical competence couldn't overcome the physical reality of multi-ton animals breaking through infantry formations. Constantius was forced to withdraw, claiming victory because he held the field briefly, but the Persians had demonstrated again that they could break Roman formations with elephant charges. The technological and tactical evolution of late Roman and Byzantine warfare can be traced directly to lessons learned from Edessa and subsequent elephant encounters. The Byzantine military system that emerged in the 6th and 7th centuries emphasized combined arms coordination, flexible formations, and heavy cavalry rather than the rigid infantry tactics of the classical legions. This wasn't solely a response to war elephants, but elephant warfare contributed to the recognition that heavy infantry formations had vulnerabilities that required new tactical approaches. The introduction of stirrups and the development of true heavy cavalry, cataphracts, and later medieval knights partially addressed the elephant problem. Heavy cavalry could maneuver around elephants, attack from angles where the beasts couldn't respond effectively, and potentially kill mahouts or hamstring elephants with lance attacks. But this solution emerged slowly over centuries, and even heavy cavalry faced significant risks engaging war elephants. A charging knight might kill one elephant before being crushed by another or pulled down by the elephant's trunk. The religious and cultural dimensions of Edessa's aftermath are particularly interesting. Early Christian writers, especially after Christianity became the state religion, interpreted Valerian's defeat and capture as divine punishment for his persecution of Christians. Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, explicitly connected Valerian's anti-Christian edicts with his humiliation at Persian hands. This interpretation served Christian apologetic purposes, but also reflected genuine attempts to make sense of a catastrophic defeat. The pagan Roman perspective was different but equally concerned with divine explanations. Traditional Roman religion emphasized the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods maintained through proper ritual and sacrifice. Military defeats were often interpreted as signs that the gods were displeased. After Edessa, there were calls for renewed attention to traditional religious observances, sacrifices to Mars and Jupiter, consultations with augurs and haruspices. The defeat had to mean something beyond simple tactical failure. This search for meaning, whether Christian or pagan, reflected the psychological difficulty Romans had, accepting that they had simply lost a military encounter because the enemy had better weapons for that specific engagement. The idea that Persian war elephants were just more effective than Roman infantry tactics in open terrain was too banal, too technical an explanation for such a catastrophic defeat. There had to be deeper reasons, moral or divine failures that explained why Roman virtue and discipline had proven insufficient. The economic consequences of Edessa rippled through the Roman economy for decades. The loss of 40,000 to 60,000 soldiers represented not just military manpower, but economic productivity. These men had been taxpayers, consumers, participants in the Roman economy. Their deaths created immediate tax revenue losses and longer-term demographic impacts. The eastern provinces, already weakened by plague, suffered further population decline. More immediately, the disruption of eastern trade routes after Edessa had severe economic impacts. Roman trade with India and eastern markets typically moved through territories that were now contested or under Persian control. Luxury goods, spices, silk, all the high-value trade items that flowed from east to west, became more expensive and difficult to obtain. This affected not just wealthy Romans who consumed these goods, but the entire network of merchants, shippers, and intermediaries who profited from the trade. The financial costs of ransoming captured soldiers and negotiating prisoner exchanges added to the economic burden. Shapur held thousands of Roman prisoners after Edessa. The traditional practice was to ransom prisoners of high rank and either enslave or integrate common soldiers into the captor's military. Ransoming officers required payment in gold, further draining Roman resources. The soldiers who couldn't be ransomed faced slavery in Persia or forced service in Persian military units, often being deployed on Persia's eastern frontiers against nomadic invaders. The propaganda value of Edessa to the Sassanian Empire was immense. Shapur's inscriptions and reliefs celebrating the victory were carved into prominent locations visible to travellers and envoys. These monuments served multiple purposes. They legitimized Shapur's rule to his own subjects, demonstrating his effectiveness as a war leader. They warned potential rebels within the Persian Empire of the king's military power. and they sent a message to Rome and other neighbouring powers that Persia was the dominant military force in the region. The famous relief at Nakshi Rostam showing Valerian kneeling before Shapur is particularly significant as a propaganda artifact. In ancient Near Eastern royal ideology, the physical posture of rulers in relation to each other signified power relationships, showing a Roman emperor, the supposed ruler of the civilized world, in a submissive posture before the Persian king of kings reversed the traditional Roman claim to universal dominance. Every Roman envoy who visited Persia after 260 CE saw this relief. Everyone carried back the image to Rome. The military reforms attempted after Edessa reveal Roman awareness that something had to change, but uncertainty about what specifically needed reform. Gallienus, Valerian's son and successor, implemented significant changes to the Roman military. He created a mobile cavalry reserve, the equites, that could respond to crises more quickly than traditional legions. He professionalized the officer corps, reducing senatorial involvement in military command in favor of career soldiers. He expanded recruitment of barbarian auxiliaries who brought different tactical traditions. These reforms were responses to multiple problems, not just the elephant threat. But the recognition that Roman military doctrine needed adaptation came partly from Edessa's lessons. The mobile cavalry reserve, for instance, could potentially avoid being fixed in place and destroyed by elephant charges. The barbarian auxiliaries, particularly Germanic cavalry and infantry, weren't trained in rigid formation tactics and might respond more flexibly to unconventional threats like war elephants. The reforms had limited immediate impact. Gallienus faced multiple usurpers and barbarian invasions during his reign, and was eventually assassinated. But the trajectory of Roman military evolution continued in the direction he initiated. By the 4th century, the Roman army looked very different from the legions that had fought at Edessa. Infantry were lighter, more mobile, less dependent on rigid formations. Cavalry had become much more important. The tactical doctrine was more flexible, acknowledging that different enemies required different approaches. The personal fate of Emperor Valerian in Persian captivity became one of the most discussed topics in late Roman literature. The story that Shapur used Valerian as a human footstool appears, in multiple sources with varying details. Lactantius claims this happened regularly, that whenever Shapur mounted a horse or chariot, Valerian was forced to kneel and allow the king to step on his back. Other sources add that Valerian was paraded before Persian nobles as an example of Roman weakness. The tale of Valerian's flayed skin being displayed in a Persian temple appears in later Roman and Byzantine sources, but is harder to verify. Lactantius, writing within living memory of events, doesn't mention it. Later writers like Cedrenus in the 11th century describe it in detail. Whether the story is true or evolved through repeated telling, it served a purpose. It represented the ultimate humiliation. The Roman emperor reduced not just to captivity but to a trophy, his very body used as a warning to future Roman envoys. Modern historians debate the accuracy of these accounts. Persian sources don't corroborate the most extreme stories. The inscriptions Shapur commissioned focus on his military victories and the tribute Rome paid, not on humiliating treatment of the captured emperor. It's possible the Romans invented or exaggerated Valerian's mistreatment to explain their failure to ransom him, or as anti-Persian propaganda. But it's equally possible that Persian sources omitted details that wouldn't fit the royal image Shapur wanted to project. The treatment of the common soldiers captured at Edessa is less documented but historically significant. Ancient sources mention that Shapur used Roman prisoners as labour for construction projects, particularly building the city of Bishapur and constructing a major dam. Archaeological evidence at Bishapur includes construction techniques more typical of Roman engineering than Persian, suggesting Roman prisoners or deserters may have provided technical expertise. Some Roman prisoners entered Persian military service. This wasn't unusual in ancient warfare. Skilled soldiers were valuable regardless of their origin, and Persian emperors regularly employed foreign troops. Roman soldiers who accepted service with Persia might be deployed on the eastern frontiers against nomadic peoples, performing essentially the same function they had in Roman service, but under different command. Others were settled in Persian territories, forming communities that maintained some Roman identity while being integrated into Persian society. The question of why more surviving Romans didn't write detailed accounts of Edessa haunts historians. We have fragments, quotations in later works, brief mentions in official histories. but no comprehensive eyewitness narrative survives comparable to Caesar's commentaries or Josephus's accounts of the Jewish war. Part of this is simply the randomness of textual survival. Most ancient texts didn't survive the Middle Ages. Works that existed in only a few copies could disappear if those copies were destroyed. But there may have been deliberate suppression. Edessa was an embarrassment to Rome, defeat so complete and humiliating that detailed accounts might have been actively discouraged. Survivors might have been reluctant to write about their experiences, fearing accusations of cowardice or failure. Official histories had political reasons to minimize or misrepresent the disaster. The result is frustrating gaps in the historical record for one of Rome's most significant defeats. The strategic balance between Rome and Persia after Edessa remained contested but fundamentally shifted toward Persia. For the next century, Sassanian forces regularly invaded Roman territory, besieged major cities, and extracted tribute. Rome responded with varying success. Some campaigns recovered lost territory. Other Roman offensives ended in disaster. But the confident Roman expansionism of earlier centuries was gone. The eastern frontier became a defensive priority rather than a jumping-off point for conquest. This strategic stalemate had long-term consequences for both empires. The constant warfare drained resources that both Rome and Persia would need when facing new threats. Arab armies erupting from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century found both the Byzantine Empire and Sassanian Persia exhausted from centuries of mutual conflict. Neither could mount effective resistance to the new threat. Within decades, Persia was conquered entirely, and Rome's eastern provinces were lost permanently. One can speculate about alternative histories. If Valerian had won at Edessa, if Roman legions had found a way to counter war elephants effectively, if the strategic balance hadn't shifted toward Persia, how might the late antique and medieval world have developed differently? Would a stronger Eastern Roman Empire have resisted Arab expansion more successfully? Would Persian military doctrine have evolved differently without the confidence boost of Edessa? These questions are unanswerable, but illustrate how single battles, particularly decisive defeats, can influence historical trajectories for centuries. The legacy of war elephants in military history extends beyond Edessa, but that battle represents perhaps their most decisive impact on European history. Elephants continued to be employed in South Asian and Southeast Asian warfare for centuries. The Mughal Empire used elephants effectively into the early modern period. But in European military thought, elephants remained associated with ancient warfare and with Persian and Carthaginian enemies Rome had eventually overcome. The medieval European imagination was fascinated by elephants. Bestiaries included elaborate descriptions, often fantastical, of elephant behaviour and appearance. Elephants appeared in artistic representations of ancient battles and exotic lands, but European powers never seriously considered employing elephants themselves. The logistical challenges were too great, and the historical examples of elephant warfare were too ambiguous. For every Edessa where elephants proved decisive, there were battles where elephants panicked and trampled their own troops. The development of gunpowder weapons ultimately rendered war elephants obsolete. Cannon and later firearms could kill elephants at ranges where the animals couldn't respond. The noise of gunpowder weapons proved more effective at panicking elephants than ancient attempts using fire or pigs. By the 16th century, even armies in South Asia, where elephants remained culturally important, began to reduce their reliance on elephant units in favour of artillery and musket-armed infantry. But in 260 CE at Edessa, gunpowder was centuries in the future. Roman soldiers faced war elephants with Bronze Age weapons, iron swords and spears that had changed little in fundamental design for 1,000 years. Against these weapons, properly trained and armoured war elephants were nearly unstoppable. The Romans learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible, and the memory haunted the empire for the rest of its existence. The common soldiers who fought at Edessa, men like Marcus Valerius whose testimony survives in fragments, carried physical and psychological scars for life. Many would have suffered from what we now recognise as post-traumatic stress disorder. Ancient medicine had no name for the psychological wounds of combat, but the symptoms were recognised. Soldiers who startled at loud noises, who couldn't sleep without nightmares, who became violent or withdrawn, these were known phenomena even if not systematically studied. The survivors of Edessa faced particular challenges. They had experienced a level of combat horror beyond normal warfare. Watching comrades crushed and trampled, seeing formations disintegrate instantly, experiencing helplessness against an enemy that couldn't be fought effectively. These were experiences that couldn't be easily processed or forgotten. The men who lived through it and eventually returned to Roman society brought those memories with them, influencing how they viewed military service, authority, and the empire itself. The families of men lost at Edessa faced their own tragedies. Soldiers killed in the battle left widows and children throughout the empire. Many of these families never received confirmation of death, only knew that their husband or father had marched east with Valerian's army and never returned. The lack of bodies, the distance from Rome, the chaos of the defeat, all meant that normal funeral rituals often couldn't be performed. This spiritual uncertainty, not knowing if proper rites had been observed, troubled Roman families who believed such rites were necessary for the dead to rest peacefully. The veterans' communities in Rome and throughout the empire were affected by Edessa's survivors. Former soldiers, often organised in associations that provided social support and maintained military traditions, had to incorporate the experiences of Edessa survivors into their collective understanding of military service. The stories these men told, stories of watching the army destroyed not through tactical failure or cowardice, but through encountering a weapon system that nullified Roman military advantages, challenged the traditional narratives of Roman military superiority. The cultural processing of Edessa took generations. Initial responses emphasized heroic resistance, blaming defeat on factors beyond military control like disease, Persian treachery, or divine displeasure. Over time, as the empire continued to struggle against Persia, and as Roman military doctrine evolved, more realistic assessments emerged. By the 4th century, military writers acknowledged that elephants were a serious threat requiring specific tactical responses, that Roman formations had vulnerabilities, that different enemies required adapted tactics. This evolution in military thinking, from assuming Roman tactical superiority to acknowledging the need for flexible, enemy-specific approaches, represents one of Edessa's lasting impacts. The battle forced Roman military theorists to think more critically about their doctrine, to question assumptions that had seemed obvious for centuries. This intellectual evolution, painful as it was, ultimately made Roman and later Byzantine military practice more effective by encouraging adaptation rather than rigid adherence to traditional methods. The physical site of the Battle of Edessa, located in what is now southeastern Turkey, has been continuously inhabited and fought over for millennia. The ancient city of Edessa, renamed Urfa, has seen countless battles. The specific location where Valerian's army was destroyed is approximately known from ancient geographical descriptions but not precisely located. No systematic archaeological excavation has been conducted specifically to find Edessa battlefield remains. This absence of archaeological evidence is typical for ancient battles. Unlike more recent conflicts that left extensive physical traces, ancient battles produced relatively little lasting material evidence. Weapons and armour were valuable and typically recovered after battle. Bodies were buried or left to decompose, leaving minimal lasting traces. Without written records, identifying a specific ancient battlefield archaeologically is extremely difficult. What survives from Edessa is textual, fragmentary accounts in multiple languages from multiple perspectives. Roman, Persian, and later Christian and Islamic sources all mention the battle, with varying levels of detail and reliability. The historian's challenge is synthesizing these sources, accounting for their biases, and reconstructing a plausible narrative of what occurred. The core facts are well established. A major Roman army was destroyed, Emperor Valerian was captured. War elephants played a significant role in breaking Roman formations. Beyond these basics, many details remain debated. The military historical analysis of Edessa has evolved significantly. Early modern historians, influenced by the military technology of their own era, often dismissed ancient battles as primitive and irrelevant to contemporary warfare. The systematic study of ancient military history as a serious academic discipline only emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. Scholars like Hans Delbruck applied critical analysis to ancient sources, attempting to determine realistic army sizes, casualty figures, and tactical possibilities. Modern scholarship on Edessa benefits from multiple disciplines. Archaeological findings from other Roman and Persian sites provide context for weapons, armour, and military organisation. Experimental archaeology, attempting to recreate ancient weapons and techniques, offers insights into combat realities. Comparative analysis of elephant warfare from other times and places, particularly South Asian conflicts, helps understand how war elephants function tactically. The result is a richer, more nuanced understanding than earlier generations possessed. The ethical and moral questions raised by Edessa are worth considering. The Roman soldiers who stood their ground as elephants charged were following orders, performing their duty as they understood it. They showed courage even when courage was insufficient. Does the fact that they were destroyed despite fighting properly diminish their valour? Roman culture would have said no, that virtue lay in fulfilling one's duty regardless of outcome. But the soldiers themselves, survivors who lived with the knowledge that their courage and discipline hadn't been enough, might have struggled with that philosophy. The Persian use of war elephants raises its own ethical questions by ancient standards. Elephants were sentient beings, intelligent animals capable of suffering, forced into combat through training that involved pain and coercion. The Mahots controlled elephants partly through affection and reward, but also through the ankus, the hooked implement that could deliver painful commands. Ancient people recognized that war elephants suffered, but animal suffering was generally not considered a moral issue the way it might be viewed today. The broader question of military innovation and adaptation emerges from studying Edessa. The Sassanians had developed war elephant tactics to a high level of effectiveness through systematic effort over generations. They recognized a capability gap and filled it. The Romans, facing this innovation, struggled to respond. Institutional conservatism, the psychological commitment to existing doctrine, logistical constraints, all prevented effective Roman adaptation. This pattern of established military powers struggling to respond to innovations from opponents recurs throughout military history. The human cost of Edessa cannot be reduced to statistics or tactical analysis. Each casualty was an individual with experiences, relationships, hopes. The 40,000 to 60,000 men lost represented countless personal tragedies. Women who never saw husbands again, children who grew up without fathers, parents who lost sons, friends and comrades scattered or killed, communities throughout the Roman Empire that sent men to the east and received only fragments of information about their fates. The survivors carried guilt alongside trauma. Survivors' guilt, the psychological burden of living when comrades died, affects combat veterans across history. For Edessa survivors, this was complicated by the nature of the defeat. They had not simply lost a hard-fought battle, they had been routed, forced to flee or surrender. Even if retreat was the only rational choice, even if standing firm would have meant pointless death, the psychological burden of survival through retreat was significant in Roman military culture that emphasized standing firm. The Battle of Edessa stands as a stark reminder that military power is contextual and contingent. Rome was a military superpower by ancient standards, possessing advantages in training, equipment, organization, and tactical doctrine that served it well in countless conflicts. But these advantages were not universal or absolute. Facing a specific weapon system in specific circumstances, Roman military power proved inadequate. The legions that had conquered the Mediterranean world were broken in seconds by Sassanian war elephants. This is the ultimate lesson of Edessa. No military system is perfect for all circumstances. No tactical doctrine succeeds against all enemies. No amount of discipline and courage can overcome fundamental mismatches in weapons technology and battlefield conditions. The Romans learned this lesson at enormous cost. The elephants had thundered through their formations, crushing men and doctrine alike, and Rome would spend the next century coming to terms with its vulnerability.